Dear friends, welcome to the Theosophical Society Point Loma. Thank you for joining us and for showing your interest in the inner human being. The fact that we place the adjective inner before human being means that humans can be divided into different aspects, or at least into two aspects, the inner and outer human. And in this talk, we will focus in particular on the inner human. And then it will become clear that the inner human being is much more complex. It's a composite being. And though the division between inner and outer is fine in itself, it does not offer the refinements and nuances that we can find in Theosophical psychology, the mysteries of consciousness. Well, we have divided the talk into three sections: the composite nature of our consciousness, that's the first part, then man, stream of consciousness, and self-forgetfulness. Well, let's start with our composite consciousness. What is a human being? Nowadays, many people don't think highly of humanity. In Christian circles, people talk about original sin. We are doomed to evil. And elsewhere too, people generally do not have a high idea of humanity. Many of us think that mankind, with their wars, the destruction of nature, and the enormous gap between the rich and poor, is making a mess of it. We don't deny that mess, but we don't attribute it to the evil of human beings. We believe that the greater obstacle to achieving a more just world is the assumption that man is inherently, merely evil, aggressive, selfish, and warlike. Theosophy is based on a completely different view of humanity. We say that humans are essentially noble beings. Yes, we even claim that they are divine beings. Humans have all the abilities to build a just, loving, and compassionate world. When we say something like that, we are, of course, immediately bombarded with examples of the cruelty that one human being inflicts on another. People point at wars, at genocides, injustice, and all the other terrible things that one human being does to another. Do we deny that? Of course not. We also read the newspaper and see the image of hunger and war on the news. However, we also see large numbers of people who, like us, find this terrible and want to do something about it. However, they struggle what needs to be done. They want to be ethical, but often lack a philosophical or religious foundation to motivate their ethics. Despite their good intentions, they are, as it were, caught between the reality of the horrors and injustices and what they should do to make the world a better, a more just, and a more peaceful place. But they don't know how to do that. Our society is characterized by a feeling of powerlessness. We can understand this feeling of powerlessness, and in some cases we even admire people who, despite their feeling of powerlessness, still try to achieve some degree of justice and peace. We would like to introduce these well-meaning people to Theosophy, not to convert them, we never do that, but to help and inspire them, because Theosophy provides arguments that clearly show that human beings are much more, much better than the activities they engage in today. For there is an inner and an outer human being. And in this talk, we will try to give you at least a glimpse of the existence of that inner human being. And I think that most people have already caught a glimpse of that inner human being at some point, because when they look deep within themselves, there is still an idea that human beings are good to put it very simply. Didn't Anne Frank write in her diary that despite everything, she still believed in the goodness of men? If we deny that intrinsic goodness, that love for our fellow human beings, it is because we don't look within ourselves, but are too focused on the outside of things. In other words, we live the life of the outer man, the outer human being, the human being who attributes truth and reality to the outer world, the world that we can perceive with our senses. Based on theosophy, we say, and please follow this very critically, that humans are not only essentially good, but they can also know the truth, or at least a much greater truth and reality than our outer world, what we now call reality, and of which theosophy states that it's nothing more than an illusion. Before we delve further into the inner human being, let us first get to know the outer human being, the human being that many consider to be the human being, the only human being. Look, if you rely completely on your senses, you see a man or a woman and judge that human being based on the action he or she performs. We attribute reality to what we perceive with our senses. But if we think a little longer, we know that the outer human being, the body and the action performed with this body, cannot be the human being. For does that human being have no feelings, no emotions? Of course they do. Sometimes we can see those emotions in the body, in facial expressions, although we have to interpret those emotions. When somebody cries, are they sad, in pain, or crying with laughter? And somebody may boiling with rage inside, but their face shows a smile. And when we say inside, we know that there must be more than just the outward appearance. Because in addition to those feelings, people have a certain urge to act. They want to do things. They are often full of desires. They want to achieve something. They have ambitions. And this can be anything: a house, a partner, power, a solution to life's questions. You can also recognize intellect in people. People can reason and organizing things. They draw conclusions from a certain amount of information. People are even more than that. They have ideals. And sometimes they are moved by the suffering of others. They help others. Most parents take good care of the children, and some also take care of their neighbors' children. They have a perhaps vague idea of how the world should be better organized. And then, very occasionally, when people are alone in the mountains or on a quiet beach, they are inspired by the silence, by the beauty of the stars, and they completely forget themselves and experience the oneness of life. All of that is also human. You examine all of these aspects in more detail later. We merely wanted to point out the fact that everyone must recognize that we are much, much more than just the outer human being. Do all these aspects belong to the inner human being? You might think so, but we have a slightly different idea. You see, the aspects with which we identify ourselves to the outer world form the outer human being, while the aspects that give us awareness that the outer human being lives in an illusion could be called the inner human being. It may sound a bit complicated, but we will elaborate on this further. However, we first want to consider the question, why do we so often think that we are the outer man? The answer is actually very simple, because we identify with the outer human being. I give you an example. When children play, they often identify with the role they are playing. I'm the king, I'm the mother, I'm the child, I'm the hero. We have all done that at some point, I think. And during the game, you feel like the king or the mother or the hero. Another comparison. An actor must identify completely with his role if he wants to be believable to the audience. During the play, he is Hamlet, he is the villain, or he is the hero. Well, we constantly identify with the outer human being, that is the human being who lives in this outer world, the world that we can perceive with our senses. However, that outer world is an illusion. Now we must explain the concept of illusion as we understand it in Theosophy. By illusion, we don't mean that our world does not exist. It does exist, but it is not permanent. It is temporary. It exists because there is another world, a force, an energy, we call it consciousness, that works behind or through it. And because we don't realize this, we believe that this world is real. It is an illusion to us. It presents itself in our consciousness, in our thinking, differently than it really is. Plato compared the external world to shadows on the wall of an underground cave. And that is a very good comparison because a shadow does exist, of course it exists, but it exists as a projection of something else. And if you think that a shadow exists on its own, then you are being deceived by your senses and you are in a state of illusion. All manifested beings, no matter how developed they may be, live in a shadow world, in an illusion, in Maya, as it is called in the East. Maya comes from the Sanskrit root ma, and the meaning of ma is to measure. So what can be measured is illusion. The philosophy of Maya implies that human thinking develop ideas that arise from certain impressions. Man interprets his life, his environment, and does so on the basis of what he sees. And because his sensory perception is very imperfect, he interprets things, the world, himself, incorrectly, and therefore creates his own Maya, his own illusions. The well-known example that we find in the Upanishads, the sacred books of India, and which is also included in our course, Universal Wisdom, is the man who comes home and is frightened because he sees a snake. On closer inspection, however, it turns out not to be a snake, but a piece of rope rolled up. His fear, however, was just as real to him as if it had really been a snake. His misperception thus gives an impulse to his thinking, which creates an illusory image. He is deceived by his senses. We call this phenomenon objective idealism. Idealism in the sense of ideas, thoughts that you form about objects, the world of phenomena. So the external world exists, and its value and its reality is determined by the ideas we have about it. We therefore create our own reality. Our thinking tells us what we call real and what we do not. We could give dozens of examples of this. For instance, we vote for a political party. Our ideas have created a certain reality for that party until we see that that party really intense. And people often feel disillusioned. They have been mistaken. Perhaps they become distrustful or cynical. In fact, they should be delighted, because every disillusion is a truth found. The reverse also exists. We strongly disapprove of something, we hate it, until we see that it is actually very noble. Now, these are examples in which we see through something, we perceive that it was an illusion, and that awareness is very important. We have the ability to see through the illusion, not only in the case of the snake and the rope through better observation, but also by better thinking. And the first step towards this is to achieve awareness that the external world does indeed exist, but only because consciousness works through it. This starting point creates the possibility of getting to know a greater reality. Now, the person who allows themselves to be fooled by the external world, in other words, regards the external world as something in itself, and thus attributes reality to a mostly false perception, that is the external man. But the one who realizes that the external world is an illusion, that is the inner man. And we need to learn to understand that inner man better. And it sounds like a paradox. Although we are that human, we must learn to become that inner human being. That inner man needs to wake up. It is therefore clear that man is a composite being, that he is made up of different aspects. The most well-known classification of man can be found in the Bible, in one of Paul's letters. There we read that man is spirit, soul, and body. This classification is undoubtedly entirely correct, but it is somewhat crude. It does not allow for finer nuances. Moreover, there is no theologian who can explain the difference between the soul and the spirit. These two concepts are also used as synonyms. According to Theosophy, however, there is a very clear distinction between the two. Nevertheless, in Theosophy, the sevenfold division is the most commonly used. Human beings are 7 aspects of consciousness, or 7 principles of consciousness. Atman, the divine; Buddhi, the spiritual; Manas, our mind, the capacity to think; Kama, desire; Prana, the vital aspect in us; Linga Sharira, literally it means the model body, and it is the astral element; and the Sthula Sharira, the physical aspect. You can also group these 7 aspects in such a way that you can see the threefold division as given in the Bible. Yeah? You can see here in this diagram that we have replaced the terms spirit, soul, and body with concepts that hopefully make the things a little clearer, namely the imperishable part of our core. It's the divine spiritual element in us, Atman Buddhi. You may call it the innermost part of the inner self, our most inner aspect. This aspect is our universal nature, which makes us interconnected with the cosmos. Then there is the intermediate part, the learning part. And finally, there is the vehicle, which consists of the lower 4 principles: desire, vitality, the astral element, and the material element. For us, the intermediate part is the most important at this moment. Why? Because in most cases we identify with it. But note that intermediate part is also composite. There is a higher manas, a higher thinking, and a lower manas, the more impersonal, lower thinking. And to make that a little clearer, we can zoom in on that intermediate part, the manas. In nature, everything repeats itself. In fact, everything is a copy of the greater whole. So the 7 principles of consciousness can be found in manas, in our thinking. There is therefore an atmic aspect of manas, there is a Buddhic aspect of manas, a manasic aspect, etc. In other words, there are 7 thinking aspects which we represent here using the terms we also use in our course, Universal Wisdom. The 3 higher aspects, the perception of unity, and then insight or intuition, and you can also add concepts such as the faculty of understanding, compassion, and impersonal love to it. That belongs to the Buddhic part of our thinking. And then third, the intellect. Those 3 form the higher manas, especially the first 2. The lower 4, the power of desire, vital thinking, feeling, and the physical thinking, and the latter means that you identify with your body, belong to the lower manas. Now let's go back to this diagram for a moment. Which of these 2 manas would see the outer world as the real world? And which of these 2 manas would have the ability to see through that outer world and recognize its illusory nature? It's the lower manas that is fooled by the outer world. It's the lower manas that we can call the outer human being. The human being who allows itself to be fooled by what the senses tell him. That human being, whose higher manas does not control the lower manas, constantly tends towards the square, so to speak, towards the outer world, and especially toward desire. Often he also identifies with the body and thinks that he is the body, or he identifies with his feelings, emotion, and is hardly aware that they are so fleeting and have no permanence whatsoever. It is this lower manas, the outer man, that we also can call the personality. In our current language, the word personality is often used in a positive sense. It means that you have a strong character. We mean something different. A personal human being, that is the lower manas, focuses on the outside of things which he misinterprets. He also misinterprets himself, if I put it that way. I mean, he sees himself as a separate being. He does not realize that he is interconnected, not only with the higher manas, and with the Buddhi and Atman, his deeper core, but also with his fellow human beings, with all living beings in nature. He's in a state of maya, of illusion. The higher manas could be called the inner man, not the innermost of the inner, because that is Buddhi Atman, but rather the thinking that focuses on the spiritual side of nature, on the triangle, so to speak. We use the technical term reincarnating ego to describe the higher manas. It is this part of our composite nature that continues to exist after death, reaps the impersonal harvest of the lower manas, the personal human being, and then experiences its adventures in the invisible worlds, and after a shorter or longer period of time returns and gathers the personal elements again, draws those personal elements back to itself. It puts the mask back on, as it were, and that mask is the personality, which in the new reincarnation will again play its role in the outer realm, but the actor, the real human being who hides behind that role, that is the higher manas. This entire process of the cycle of light and death and the process of reincarnation which I have now explained in just a few sentences, is discussed in detail in our course, Universal Wisdom. It is also the higher manas that sees through the outer appearances of this world of phenomena. Now, the remarkable fact is that we often lack confidence in ourselves, in our higher manas. We deny its existence. It is because of our strong identification with the outer world that we don't trust ourselves. I mean, our inner self, our inner dignity, our influences originating from the higher aspects of the composite being that we are. You are undoubtedly familiar with this. I really want to do it, but I can't. Or I want to do it, but it's not working anyway. Or distrust others. I really want to do it, but others don't want it anyhow. You know, when you lose confidence in yourself, you also lose confidence in others. And then the world will indeed not change. Yes, if you assume that there will always be war, your desire for peace will have little or no effect. It's interesting to see that this lack of trust in our inner self often comes to the fore in myths. And that lack of trust in yourself is the cause why things go wrong. You know the myth of Orpheus in the underworld. His beloved Eurydice, symbol of the divine, was there, and as a special exception, he was allowed to descend into the Hades, to the underworld, to free her. She was to follow him, but he was not allowed to look back. And unfortunately, he had doubts. Was she still following him? He did not trust the situation, and he looked back and lost her. This is also very clear in the myth of Psyche and the god Cupid. We know this myth from Latin tradition, but it is most likely originates from ancient Greece. This myth is perhaps even clearer than that of Orpheus, because Psyche represents the human soul. Not the higher human soul, but the lower one, kama manas, to use technical terms. So the lower manas. The Greek verb from which the word psyche is derived means to cool down, to make cold. In other words, it is not warmed by the heart, by the more inner side of man. You may be familiar with the myth. The beautiful Psyche is to be married off to a monster. She's taken to a high mountain where the monster is supposed to pick her up. But she ends up in a magnificent palace where all her wishes are granted. In the evening, when it's dark, her husband, her lover, visits her. She feels strongly attracted to him, but she has doubts, lacks confidence, and despite being told not to look at her husband, she lights an oil lamp at night and is shocked and amazed to see that her husband is the god Cupid. A drop of oil falls on Cupid, he wakes up and leaves her forever. If you doubt the presence of your own divinity, you lose it. The self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet, we read in the voice of silence. The love between the earthly soul, Psyche, and the inner divinity cannot be realized in the earthly sphere, in the world of Maya. Now you must realize that although Psyche represents the lower soul, our personality living in the outer world, it is nevertheless divine in essence. Everything is divine at its core. Everything comes from the divine, including the personality, even if it has forgotten that divinity. The divine is often so unknown that it evokes fear and is represented as a monster. Don't we recognize that too. We have to do something that we find difficult, that we may not dare to do, that we dread, and that is actually something very beautiful. Now, you should not think of myths as strange fantasies. Myths are our story. They tell us everything about ourselves. We are Psyche. We are also the divinity, Cupid. It is the lower soul, the cold soul, which has no faith in its own divinity. It's a human being who wants a sign, something material, something with which he can prove something to himself. But we are also the divine within. And even if we cannot see it, we are not yet that far developed. We still can perceive it. We can feel it. Not feel as an emotion, but perceive it with our body, with our spiritual faculty. This is what the voice of the silence, Helena Blavatsky's little wonderful book says about this. It reads, silence thy thoughts, meaning thoughts directed towards the outer world. Silence thy thoughts and fix thy whole attention on thy master, meaning the inner master. And now comes the important part, whom yet thou dost not see, but whom thou feelest. Fortunately, the myth of Psyche and Cupid ends happily. And this is because Psyche recognizes the illusory nature of the beautiful palace. She sets out. She does not give up, but goes in search of her lover. She finds the goddess Aphrodite, who gives her several tasks, difficult tasks, almost impossible tasks. And when she carries out these tasks with confidence, note confidence, she's helped by nature, because she cooperates with nature. Because as soon as you submit to the laws of nature, you get the wind of the spirit in your sails, and that's why she succeeds in completing these almost impossible tasks and is ultimately permanently united with Cupid on Mount Olympus. All's well that ends well. On earth, that is, when your mentality is still focused on the outside of things, when you still live in the outer man, the marriage with Cupid, that is the unification with the divine, could not take place. It must take place in the exalted divine realms. The gods don't descend. We must ascend to the divine world. Now we said that Psyche and Cupid should be understood as forces, consciousnesses within ourselves. And this is an idea that may be difficult to understand, but it is essential if you want to understand something of the complexity of human beings, and also of the discovery of the inner human being. The word discover means that something that exists is covered, and that you remove the cloth or veil or whatever it may be that covers it. But you must have awareness that it already exists. Columbus did not invent America, nor was America asleep or latent or not present. Of course not. It existed and had its own life, and Columbus discovered that. And why do I say this so emphatically? Because the image of a human being and of his spiritual growth is often presented as if the higher aspects are asleep or inactive or unevolved. And in this context, we speak of man as a sleeping Buddha. However, the inner man, of whom we spoke earlier, is in fact the human Buddha. But he's not asleep, he's wide awake. It would be a remarkable contradiction if a Buddha were a sleeping entity. The word Buddha comes from the Sanskrit root Bud, which means to awaken. How can you be an awakened sleeper? Now, it's the personal human being who sleeps. Or to put it in terms of the myth of Psyche, Psyche sleeps. She cannot perceive the divine. And if you think about this a little bit more deeply, you will have the awareness that our higher principles do not sleep, but are awake. And now comes another thought that seems difficult, but is actually quite logical. What are these principles of consciousness? And we talked about the 7 principles of manifestation, Atman, Buddhi, Manas, etc. We were talking about abstractions. Principles of consciousness are abstractions, just as colors are abstractions, or length, or width. Of course, there are objects that are red or blue, and objects that are wide or long, but in themselves, red or width or length are abstractions. Well, when we speak of Atman, Buddhi, Manas, we actually mean by those principles of consciousness that there are beings who have these characteristics and that they form an atomic or Buddhic or monastic field or sphere or world. So the principle of consciousnesses within us are actually beings belonging to the same stream of consciousness as we do. And this gives a much better picture of the composition of our consciousness. Our higher parts are not dormant things. No, they are a unity of entities, a spiritual cosmos in miniature, just as different entities in our body form a unity, a hierarchical unity with the heart and the brain and the other organs, the cells, etc., a multitude of living beings operating as a unity. So we are part of a unity of living beings, all belonging to the same stream of consciousness, but in different stages of consciousness. Some are more evolved than others. And that means that within us, in the stream of consciousness that we are, there is a God, there is a Buddha, there is a Master. It was Gottfried de Perucker who in his book Fundamentals of the Esoteric Philosophy gave shape to this idea in the so-called egg diagram. You can study this diagram for weeks, for months, for years, and still not fully understand it. But let's try to explain it in general terms. Man is a stream of consciousness, and belonging to that stream of monads, centers of consciousness. A monad is a center of consciousness that is essentially boundless. Helena Blavatsky speaks of it as a divine spark, a spark of the eternally burning fire. Each monad is in a certain phase, in a certain stage of development. And that means that from those monads, a soul or ego has flowed, has emanated. There is a difference between the two, between a soul and an ego, but we will leave that here now. Well, that soul or ego is in a certain phase, at a certain stage of evolution or development, a divine stage, and then we speak of the innermost part of our being, Atman, or that monad is in a stage of Buddhi, the principle of enlightenment. Then we speak of Jiva Atman, the Buddha within us, the second circle from the top. And then there is the true human being, the higher manas, as we called it in the triangle square diagram, Buddhatman, or the human ego. And then there is the personal human being, Pranatman, the personal ego it is called. And finally, there is the beast soul and the body. We are not concerned with all these Sanskrit terms. It is the idea that matters. And you can see that these circles with the different monads are becoming darker and darker. This is to indicate that they become increasingly limited, expressing the inherent possibilities that lie within them. Some people experience a kind of identity crisis when they see this diagram. Who am I? They ask themselves. Well, think of objective idealism, remember? Reality for us is what we attribute reality to. We attribute reality, at least the greater majority of people do, to this external world. We are that personal ego. But we are also the high human ego, and the Buddha, and the God. These are living forces within us. But we are asleep, just like Psyche. And we want a proof, we want a sign. And we believe that this sign comes from the earth. But Pranatman, the personal ego, is also a monad. And it is a monad in whom self-consciousness has already awakened. The manas, the thinking faculty, has awakened. It is still the lower manas, often focused on the outer world, but it is active. You can also see in the diagram the arrows coming out of Paramatman, the supreme self, which means that these monads have already developed self-consciousness. They are self-conscious. So we, as personal egos, we are self-conscious. We can make choices. And by making choices, we call this self-directed evolution. By making choices, we can focus on those higher principles, that is, on the higher aspects in the stream of consciousness that we are. And when we do that, we wake up in the more inner areas. We actually remove a veil from our consciousness. And then we discover the spiritual, divine powers within us, which manifest themselves in us. And by us, I mean the personal human ego. Those spiritual divine powers within us manifest themselves in us as insight, wisdom, intuition, understanding, compassion, inspiration. Compare it to a radio that changes frequency. You tune your radio, your consciousness to a different station, and thereby receive different information, different music coming from those higher layers within you. And of course, this is already happening, but usually only in small doses, occasionally. A clear idea, perhaps an intuition, our conscience kicking in when we want to do something unethical, but in most people it is quite weak. So we do not need to create our higher nature, the inner human being. We do not need to invent it because it is already there. It's only covered by a veil. And what is this veil that covers the inner human being? That veil consists of our own thoughts, desires, and feelings. That veil is formed by the outflows, the emanations that flow from our personal ego, the personality. As we will explain in lesson 6 of our course Universal Wisdom, thoughts are living entities. And although they are at the bottom of the hierarchy of consciousness, just like other beings, they are born, they can die, and they have their own characteristics. They are unconscious beings that exist in connection and in cooperation with humans, the thinkers. We feed them with our attention. They live in us, move in us, and have their existence in us, just as we are building blocks in the greater cosmos. If we think a certain thought, or number of thoughts, often that thought becomes stronger. And if we no longer focus our attention on it, it becomes weaker and eventually dies. Thoughts are of many kinds. And for clarity, by thoughts we also mean feelings and desires. There are noble thoughts, great ideas about the interconnectedness of all beings, the essential unity of all expressions of life, thoughts of compassion and love. And there are also selfish thoughts. In these thoughts, the personal ego is central. These thoughts limit us. These thoughts make us small and form a veil around us, a shell. And to be clear, this is not a metaphor. To explain it fully, you would need an entire talk, but let's say something about it, anyway, at least. And therefore we need the egg diagram. The different monads are drawn in an egg shape for a reason, because this entire stream of consciousness is surrounded by an astral substance. And by astral substance, I mean matter, substance that is more ethereal, finer than the matter we know. And in the higher layers of the egg, this substance, akasha it is called, is very elevated, very refined. This akasha becomes less and less refined and ethereal. It gets coarser and coarser. And note that matter does not exist. Everything is alive. So that egg-shaped shell that envelopes the entire stream of consciousness is made up of life, of living building blocks. And because these different monads in the stream of consciousness, from cosmic consciousness, Atman, down to the earthly consciousness, the physical body, that egg-shaped shell reaches from the furthest reaches of our cosmos to our body. The body is actually the dregs or a sediment of it. What happens when we are selfish? When we have selfish desires? When we only think of ourselves? Then we shape that astral substance in such a way that we create a veil within or around ourselves through which we no longer perceive the influence, the influx of the higher monads in that stream of consciousness. We emanate a cloud of personal thoughts, feelings, and desires which blocks the sunlight of the inner man. Or to use another image, it is as if you turn off your radio receiver, or at least tune it into a frequency other than that of the inner man. In Theosophical literature, you will find comments such as, the only barrier to spirituality is yourself. And how true this is. It is the lower self, the personality, that demands all attention and thereby creates a barrier that prevents you from connecting with the higher, the nobler influences in the stream of consciousness that you are. I think most of us will sometimes have spoken to someone who held very dogmatic and selfish ideas. You can talk until you are blue in the face. You can present arguments to support a particular idea, but as you will often hear, it seems as if you cannot get through to him. Well, consider what we said above, and you will understand that this not getting through can be taken literally. The veil that some people have drawn around their own lower self is so dense, is so impenetrable, that no thoughts other than their own dogmas or hobby horses can get through it. In such cases, talking is pointless. The only thing you can do is to inspire wonderment in the other person through your own mentality and behavior, so that they may begin to view themselves a little bit more objectively. But if we are honest, we may have to admit that we too have our own hobby horses, that we too may have quite a few personal thoughts, and that we have therefore also erected a barrier around ourselves, preventing the influence of the higher monads in the stream of consciousness from reaching us. What should we do about this? The answer is very simple. Self self-forgetfulness. We must no longer give our personal self the attention it constantly demands. And to be clear, it is not that Pranatman, the personal ego, is bad. Certainly not. It is merely limited. And if, out of its own limitation and ignorance, believes it must determine the direction we take, then that will undoubtedly lead to misery. So, if we want to discover the inner human being, we must remove the veils of the personal human being, and we do that by no longer thinking the thoughts and desires that weave such a veil. We must empty ourselves. And this process of emptying oneself can be found in virtually all mystics in the East and the West. In other words, it is widely known that our personal thoughts prevent us from connecting with our deeper self, the inner man. What exactly do we mean by emptying? Well, all petty, weak, selfish, ambitious thoughts, such as, why am I having so much trouble? And how mean they are to me. In Brazil, they call this crying with a full stomach. Yeah? But also hurtful, disdainful thoughts towards others. All these thoughts, all arising from our little selves. If we could empty ourselves from them, then we would unveil our inner self. We will wake up in a different realm. Have you ever stopped to think in the evening when you go to sleep how many petty, useful thoughts you have had that day? Thoughts that serve no purpose and that all came from your personality. It's good to think about that. You will then realize how much time you have wasted on trivialities, time that you could have used to think selfless thoughts, cherish spiritual and compassionate ideas, ponder universal brotherhood as a fact of nature. Now, this emptying must be an active process. If you are passive and wait until you no longer think such thoughts coming from that little me, then I assure you that not much will happen. It also doesn't help if you start fighting these personal thoughts, if you start waging a battle against them, as if to say, I must not think this, I should not think this thought. No, this only makes these thoughts stronger, because thoughts, as we have already said, are living beings and are fed by our attention. So negative attention also makes a thought stronger. Anyone who wants to reform their character by fighting against the characteristics they want to overcome is doomed to fail, because their focus on the character flaws only make those flaws stronger. Or then, we already said it, it's about self-forgetfulness. You simply must not pay attention to these personal and petty thoughts. They are not worth your time. In short, you have to think about something else. And how do you do that? Through concentration and meditation. Those are two keywords. But I think I need to explain them properly, because in Theosophy, we often understand these two terms differently than what is generally understood. What do we mean by concentration? We mean concentration on an impersonal mental image, concentration on an ideal, on an image that no one else has created, but that you have formed yourself. It's a mental image. And in that image you paint, not with paint, but with your thoughts, what you think the ideal world looks like. Formulated in positive terms, of course. You concentrate on that image, and you don't do that forcefully, but calmly. It is wonderful and soothing to do this. The study of Theosophy helps to form an impersonal ideal, and by that I certainly don't mean only what we call the technical teachings, which are certainly difficult to understand at first, or perhaps better said, seem difficult to understand. If you study the three most important principles of Theosophy, then you actually have the ingredients for an image of a lofty ideal. And the first fundamental proposition, the boundless principle, shows that we all not only belong together, but actually are parts of each other. Yes, we are the other. After all, the eternal, boundless, omnipresent principle knows no boundaries and is everywhere. So it's you and it's me. Think about it. And you will understand that brotherhood is a fact in nature. The fundamental principle of cyclicity implies that beings come and go. And when they come, when they manifest themselves in the outer realm, there is cooperation. There are connections, because no being can live alone. And the third fundamental proposition reveals something of these relationships, the laws, the habits of nature that operate everywhere. We sum this up in saying, so above, so below. It shows the hierarchies of life, and no matter where you are on that hierarchy, you are equivalents to everyone elsewhere. And all beings are in a process of growth, the obligatory pilgrimage, as Helena Blavatsky calls it. Ponder these three propositions. Not for nothing do we begin our course, Universal Wisdom, with it, and you will empty yourself of all those useless thoughts that arise from the personality. And then meditation. What do we mean by that? Well, it's very similar to concentration, but perhaps the subtle difference is that in meditation, you are completely absorbed in the mental image. Nowadays, there are many forms of meditation, from yoga and other techniques. And from the perspective of Theosophy, we argue that aids, certain body postures and so on, are not necessary, and sometimes even hinder, because they focus attention on the outside of things. You can meditate on anything, but you can only meditate safely if your goal is completely selfless. Spiritual meditation begins with an impersonal love for all that is. Now, impersonality, of being super personal, as we also call it, doesn't mean that you are indifferent to the world, that you are indifferent to wars and hunger and the immense sadness of the world. Certainly not. But an impersonal mentality means that you become increasingly indifferent to your own small desires, your own wishes and longings. And if you manage to develop this mentality, the forces of your inner being will become stronger and stronger within you, and you will be able to help improve the atmosphere of the world, the climate of thought on our earth, and make it more humane. And that is a very real contribution to alleviating the suffering in the world. You can meditate anytime, anywhere. Whether you are sitting on the couch, lying in bed, or walking through the streets of the city, with some practice, you can abstract your thinking to spiritual matters and still be fully present and aware of what is happening around you. It's like a woman who is happily expecting a baby. And that's a little bit different than a pregnant woman, yeah? Now, that woman, she goes to work, does the shopping, cooks a meal, thinks many other thoughts, but in the background of her consciousness, there's always the image of the child she's going to give birth to. Well, in the same way, we can carry within us, in everything we do and don't, the image of universal brotherhood, so that all our thoughts and actions are colored by that ideal. Now, we're not saying that this can be achieved in one go, To learn the ability to truly concentrate and meditate, you must make a constant effort. You cannot learn to play the guitar or the violin in a day, or learn mathematics in a weekend. It takes time and effort. But with every effort you make, provided you renew it constantly, you build up, as it were, a store of spiritual power which makes the true practice of meditation easier and more efficient over time. If you could practice concentration and meditation to perfection, then we would walk as gods on earth. You would then have become transparent channels, translucent mirrors to which the divine light, the exalted universal wisdom and knowledge, unhindered by anything, unhindered by personal veils, the divine wisdom and divine light would then shine through us. But now we are talking about very, very highly advanced humans, the masters of life, the masters of compassion and knowledge, wisdom. But however far that may seem, let us not forget that it is the future of us all. And that future begins here and now. It can begin by filling out the registration form for our course, Universal Wisdom. So we can develop the tools to control our thinking, that is, to be the master of it, and increasingly become the inner human being we are in our hearts, and thereby becoming a blessing for our fellow human beings. Our course Universal Wisdom begins on Sunday, November 16. Our website has all the information. And if anything is unclear, please let us know. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. You've now the opportunity to ask some questions, and then we will remove to our study on Zoom. And if you don't have the Zoom link yet, just go to our website, enter your name and email, especially your email, and you will get the link. So I hope to see you soon in the study. But now first, your questions. Well, welcome back. Astrid, are there any questions?
Yeah, we have 3 questions so far. The first question is, the course Universal Wisdom, does the course include the whole field of Theosophy? And is the content of the course all practical in daily life?
The first part of the question, no, because Theosophy is an ocean. And we cannot, in just 14 lessons, put an ocean in a cup. So no, that's impossible. But no book, whatever you find on earth, it cannot include all Theosophy. But it gives, I think, the course all the most principal ideas you can find in the course, of course. And the second question, I can full-hearted say, yes, it is very practical. It is very practical. At least it depends, of course, on the participants. If they want to study it and do nothing with it, it's their free will. But we intend to make it very practical. So each lesson has some questions or assignments. And so you have to try to find out in your own life, in the world, if what we say is true. And then there are some questions that you have to, implement those ideas in your own life. Not that we're asking about it, because that's your own free will again, but we give many, many practical examples and many practical ideas to imply it in your own life.
Okay, sounds good. There's a question in the chat that says, so the devil, and then devil between quotes, is also divine in essence. I don't understand that.
Oh yeah, of course. Now, the devil doesn't exist, but let's say a very ugly and very selfish man in the heart of his heart is also a divine spark. He's blinded he is he's drifted away from what he really is, but in his core, it is a divine being. And well, that's very different than nowadays we are taught, especially by the so-called sin that we get from Eve, because all those stories of and Calvin, who said that we are born to be evil, etc., etc. No, we are divine beings. We are spiritual beings living on earth, and we are lost. We are lost in the labyrinth that the earth often is, but we are not bad. We don't know what we really are. And our task as Theosophists is to show men their inner core, their inner value, the possibilities they have within themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
I know it's very difficult to think that. If you see all the cruelty in the world, you sometimes, because you feel so powerless, as I tried to explain in the lecture, that you don't see any way out of it. But then you should realize that even the most selfish man or woman, in its core, is a divine spark.
Could you say that feeling powerless is an emotion, like a personal emotion then?
Yeah, and a very emotion that I personally can very well understand.
Yeah.
If you see, for instance, the most terrible wars and genocides and all those terrible things that happen in our world, and you want to do something, you want to help, but you feel powerless. But then you should realize that the suffering in the world is because of the mental climate we created with every one of us. So if you really want to change the world, you have to change the thoughts, the mentality of human being. And the best way to change mentality of human being is to show what they really are. So Theosophy shows the structure of the universe and the fact that we all come from the same source, so to speak, and that we are in fact children of the earth, but children of the sun as well, and children of the cosmos, that we are divine, noble beings. If we can make that clear, then we will change our mindset, our thoughts, and because of that, we change our habits and we change the acts, and we have a very, very real influence on other human beings.
Yeah. Okay. The last question is in a book I read by William Quan Judge, he said that as the manas reincarnates, it divides into higher and lower manas. The lower manas is the personality or the mask. Is that correct?
Yes, that is very correct. The word personality comes from the Latin persona, and persona is a mask. And it's very interesting that in those plays in Greece, and I think also in Rome, but for sure in Greece, the actors had a mask before their face so that the audience could see the role they play. Well, that's exactly what our personality is. Our personality is not bad, but it is a role, and behind that personality, persona, it shines through it. Yeah, behind that personality is the real human being. And that real human being makes use of a personality. In my case, my personality is Barend. I'm a man living in the Netherlands, etc., etc. But that is not the real me. That's the role. And behind me, there is a higher manas. And behind the higher manas is the inner God. So if you realize that, and if you focus, if you realize, and that's one of the things we try to teach in our course Thinking Differently, all those different aspects of our consciousness, if you recognize them, if you feel them, you see them, you perceive them in yourself and in others, and then you can make a choice. Well, I don't want to identify not with the personality per se, but with something which is behind it, the real human being. I will identify with the Buddhic aspect. And that's possible. That's possible. So you change as a human being, and therefore you change also a little bit the world.
Yeah. You say the course thinking differently, but I assume you
Oh,
yeah,
that's an old
universalism.
habit.
Okay, that's okay.
It once was thinking differently, but
Yeah.
in a couple of years we updated it, and I think it's better now. It's the course Universal Wisdom. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
No more questions.
Okay. Well, thank you for the questions. I think it take a few seconds to go to Zoom. Just stay on Zoom if you are on Zoom, and if you're not on Zoom, you can participate in our study if you go to our website and leave your email. So I hope to see you in a few seconds. But yes, the lecture for next week. We start a series of lectures next week. The Theosophia, and Theosophia is a little bit different than Theosophy, as we will explain next week. The mother of all religions. And next week, the title is The Universal Theosophical Movement. I hope to see you again. And if you didn't do the course Universal Wisdom, well, think about it. And we end with Gayatri, the Gayatri of the Rig Veda. And the golden sun is the innermost of your inner part of your consciousness. So you are that golden sun, yeah? O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.